Hello everyone. This will be a lecture on Christina Rossetti's poem Goblin Market. As far as I remember, I had covered almost all the topics related to this poem in the class, and we had different sessions of discussion on this topic. But still, I would like to make a video almost as a kind of conclusion to the lecture, which was interrupted by the lockdown. However, I must mention that when you sit down to make your notes on Goblin Market or write an answer or prepare the text, you refer to the class notes and not exactly this video, because it's almost impossible to recreate whatever I have said or whatever little important things I have mentioned in the class, because class ambience is very different from this online lecture session where I have no audience in front of me. So yes, in terms of reliability, I would suggest that you go by your class notes, you go by the class lectures, and if some of you have missed those lectures, then take down from your friends, because I'm pretty sure there were a number of students who regularly attended the classes on Goblin Market, and they have taken down all the important points. However, once you are done with that, you can obviously come back to this lecture as a kind of conclusion or something like that. So to begin with, and to sort of revise very quickly, we are all acquainted with Christina Rossetti, and not as a sister of D.G. Rossetti, because she has a place of her own in the literary canon. She is basically an English poet who wrote a variety of poems, be it romantic or devotional or children's poems, but she is best known for Goblin Market. She has been a member of the Pre-Raphaelites. She had two brothers and a sister, D.G. Rossetti, who was obviously an influential artist, and we all know him. And other than that, she also had her brother William Michael and her sister Maria, and they both became writers. Now, Christina Rossetti was the youngest of the child, and she was homeschooled like most of the women during the Victorian age who had no permission to go outside and, study, for example, in the Oxford or the Cambridge University, just like their brothers. So they had very little opportunity in that sense. She was therefore homeschooled by her parents, and she was made to study religious works and classics and fairy tales and novels. And also we have come to know from her biographical details that she was extremely influenced by the work of Italian scholars and artists and revolutionaries, who always filled their home, and they used to come for discussion and stuff like that, and they had a deep impact on Rossetti's later writing. Now, what happened after a point of time, Rossetti's father's physical and mental health went down. I mean, he was suffering from bronchitis, tuberculosis, he was losing his sight, he gave up teaching, and as a result, he suffered from depression. So naturally, it was her mother who began teaching in order to escape poverty, and her sister Maria, she became a governess, and it's a kind of a profession which was very common for women, but something that Christina Rossetti did not want to pursue in her own life. At the age of 14, she herself suffered from a nervous breakdown, and she was made to, isolate herself, and there were bouts of depression and related illness which followed. So this is also a very common trait that we can find in a number of female writers like Virginia Woolf and Sylvia Plath and Charlotte Perkins Gilman and so on. And then again, after a point of time, she turned extremely spiritual, because her mother and sister and herself, they became absorbed in the Anglo-Catholic movement. So this, which developed in the Church of England, and this religious devotion, it had a very important role in her life as well as in her writings. So Christina Rossetti has written a number of poems. You can go to her Wikipedia page and get to know those names, and if you're interested, you can read them up as well. For example, The Princess Progress, another poem, Sing Song, a nursery rhyme. Then we have Commonplace and Other Stories, but most importantly, the one prescribed in our syllabus, Goblin Market and Other Poems. So in this particular poem, Goblin Market, there are different topics which are important, and we have discussed them individually in the classes. And I would just like to repeat those topics once more for your convenience. The first one is definitely the source or the origin of Goblin Market, which appears to be very important to me, like why at all she came up with the idea of writing Goblin Market. Following which, I believe the idea of capitalism and consumerism becomes pertinent in the context of the goblin and the way they are trying to, lure and tempt the audience to come and buy their fruits, where fruit is not just a literal fruit, but it's a lot more than that. And the cries of the goblin men, come buy, come buy. So all these things have definitely a very strong capitalist and consumerist, resonance. Then we have also talked about Christianity, redemption, and spirituality, how Goblin Market is trying to subvert the age-old patriarchal biblical idea of Jesus Christ as the hero and the savior of mankind, and all the female characters who act either as a nurse or either, or as a kind of lover to the hero who has come down to save the earth. So this dismantling the very patriarchal and heteronormative biblical structure which we have been following for such a long time, that is something which Goblin Market tries to break perhaps. And obviously the idea of universal sisterhood, which also somewhere involves female sexuality and eroticism and a kind of lesbian relationship between Laura and Lizzie, that becomes important as well. Now, the story of the poem is very simple. I don't think I need to explain that, but just to put it in a very summarized manner, it basically revolves around two sisters, Laura and Lizzie, and the two names are very problematic because they are somehow phonetically similar, and they begin with L, and they have the same number of alphabets and so on. So we tend to confuse time and again who is Laura and who is Lizzie. And this confusion is perhaps very much intended on the part of the writer, because after a point of time, you do not realize whether Laura and Lizzie are two different individuals or they are just the two sides of the same human being. So basically Laura and Lizzie, they are the two sisters, and we do not see that there is any man in the story because there is no mention of the parents. There is no mention that they are married to someone else. So the only man that we come across are the goblin men, who are described as half human and half animals. Now these goblin men, they have this tendency to shout and, describe the names of extremely delicious and juicy fruits in a manner that would tempt the villagers to come and buy the fruits. And obviously Laura and Lizzie are not the first one. We know that before them there was this girl called Jeannie, who was extremely tempted by the call of the goblins. She went there and had the fruits, and after that she met with a really bad fate because she died, and in her grave we cannot see any life, as in no grass grows on her grave. So this is a kind of a cautionary tale which keeps coming back time and again. Now we don't know for sure whether Jeannie was really there, or was it the kind of patriarchal fabrication of a story just to terrify other women from going beyond their sexual barriers. So we don't know. I mean, it's not meant very explicit, but it's something that we must take into consideration. And the very, reference to Jeannie as a kind of potential bride and a kind of potential mother also problematizes it, because, Jeannie is a girl. I'm pretty sure she had her own ideas and she was an individual in herself. But to talk of Jeannie solely in terms of a marriage material and a mother is where patriarchy comes into action. So nobody is bothered that Jeannie has died. They are bothered that Jeannie, who could have become a very good wife and a very good mother, has died. So yeah, her individuality is almost erased under the patriarchal demand for, performing the roles of a dutiful wife and mother. So Yeah. Now talking about Laura and Lizzie, we understand that they are both very different because Lizzie is someone who is quiet and calm and obedient, almost like the Victorian concept of the angel in the house, someone who is always charming and always sacrificing, ready to do everything for the good of the family, and specifically a family that involves men. So that is the concept of the angel in the house, which we have discussed several times in the class since first semester. So what happens here is Laura, on the other hand, is of a different orientation because she's someone who wants to explore the world, who wants to go outside and see what's going on. She wants to go beyond the barriers which have always tried to relegate women into the domestic sphere. So yeah, she's always inquisitive and she is curious about the ongoing affairs of the world, and that's what women should be. But then again, we have been conditioned into not being like that kind of a person, thanks to patriarchy. Now, what happens? The goblins, they come one day, and as usual, they are crying and they're trying to persuade people to buy their fruit and so on. And we see that Laura, she cannot resist the temptation, and she goes and she wants to buy the fruit. And what is important is she buys the fruit by cutting a lock of her golden hair. So the sexual commodification becomes extremely apparent here. And then she takes the fruits and she eats them, and then she returns home. Now, from the next day, a sort of craving begins. She wants to have more of those fruits. She wants to meet the goblins, but she cannot hear their cries anymore, unlike Lizzie, who can still hear the cries. So this is how she starts, pining away and winning away, and she is almost on the verge of dying. When Lizzie discovers that Laura is in a critical situation, she becomes the savior. She wants to take up the role of the hero, who is usually a Prince Charming in the story, coming to save the damsel in distress. But here it's just another woman. And this is the point that Christina Rossetti is trying to make, that you don't need a man to survive. You don't need a man to help yourself out in distress. I mean, it can be anyone. It can be your sister. It can be your female friend. It can be your mother. So the age-old conception that women cannot become friends of another woman is obviously challenged in this context. So Lizzie picks up the courage, and she goes and confronts the goblin men and asks them to give the fruit. But their condition is, you can't take the fruits away from us. You will have to sit down and have it with us, which she does not want, of course, because she wanted the fruit as a sort of antidote to bring the sister back into life. So what she does is she refuses, and the moment she refuses, the goblin men, they kind of jump upon her, and if you just read those lines, you'll understand those are the lines of molestation. Those are the lines which symbolize rape. So yes, she is raped by the goblin men. Why? Just for saying a no. And that is again like so much relevant to the patriarchal society where we live, because dare you say a no to a man, your life is ruined forever. But then again, I also mentioned in the class that if you say yes, then you will be considered to be very easy, who is ready to go to bed, and someone who is a whore, someone who is a slut. But if you say no, then obviously their ego is, totally shattered, and they can't obviously accept it. So naturally she is raped, but she manages not to open her mouth. She fights till the end, and she returns and she calls Laura, and whatever fruit juice was smeared upon her body, she asks Laura, come and lick me and kiss me and have this juice and consume this juice so that you can, bring yourself back to life. And again, if you read those lines, the encounter between the two women, it will give you the very implicit sexual erotic overtones between the two sisters. So we can also assume that they are the two lovers. Okay, and this is what I keep telling you, that the relationship between Laura and Lizzie is very it's blurred, because you can't just say they're sisters. Obviously they are biological sisters, but they're more than that. They are friends, they are lovers. They also act as a mother and daughter, because Lizzie is caring for Laura just like a mother. Lizzie is supportive of Laura as a friend. Lizzie is having a kind of erotic encounter, making love to Laura just as a lover. So there are this multiplicity of relationships between Lizzie and Laura. And so that is the end. And in the end, what happens, it says that these two sisters, they get married, they become wives, and they narrate the experience of goblin men to their children. Now this is again very important. I tell you why. It's not mentioned that they are married to so and so men. It's not mentioned that they were respectively married to the husbands. There's no mention of the term husband, so we don't know whether they actually married two men or they're married to one another, because it's probable that they are the wives to one another. They decide to live with one another because they're in love with one another. And the children which is mentioned need not be their biological children. It can also be that they are referring to the kids who they met in their lives, and they narrate the stories. And the kids in this case also refers to the readers, because primarily the poem was written for the audience who were children. Okay, it is we, the critics, and the teachers and the professors who kind of dissected the poem and obviously brought out the various readings, but primarily it was meant for the children. So we can understand that this is kind of taken up as a tale to be shared by the child readers. Okay, so yeah, this is something that we need to reconsider. Just because it's mentioned they become wives and they have children doesn't mean that they enter into the very heteronormative, wedlock, getting married to husbands and raising children, and continuing the cycle of the age-old story. So this poem is very interesting because it can have two readings. One reading that will tell you that Laura was someone who did a grave mistake by going beyond the boundary and crossing the lines, and the way she had been experimenting with her sexuality being a female, and that's obviously derogatory. But the other reading, which is more liberal, which is more progressive, will tell you that it's okay to go outside and explore your sexuality, and it's not your fault that you went outside to explore the sexuality. It is obviously the fault of the patriarchal society, which kind of affected you in a negative manner by raping you or by molesting you. There's no harm in exploring the sexuality. And third point, sexuality is always, explained in terms of male sexuality. We always talk about male desire and male fantasies and male pleasures, and women only, they kind of become an instrument in this process of providing pleasure to men. But that's not the case. Women have pleasures too. Women have fantasies too. And women have desires too. And those need to be validated as much as you validate the pleasures of men. So that is something which is mentioned in this poem. Obviously, about the sources, I have already said the different sources from which this poem was inspired. One was definitely, there was a time when Christina Rossetti used to, spend a lot of hours at Mary Magdalene's home, which was basically a home for the fallen women and the prostitutes. So she came across them from a very close quarter, and therefore she wrote down about their experiences. And also the place where they used to stay as a child, they didn't have a very, a high-class neighborhood, and it was believed that those neighbors were nasty and they indulged in some disrespectful activities. So all they were allowed to was have a glimpse from the window. They were not allowed to go and play with the neighbor kids because they were fallen in a sense. And these two sisters, Christina Rossetti and Maria, they also reflect the relationship between Laura and Lizzie, because Maria was very much like Lizzie, who was obedient and polite, an angel in the house, whereas on the other hand, Christina Rossetti was extremely curious and inquisitive and ready to taste all the flavors of the world. So yeah. And there are other sources, for example, the fairy tales. I think I had given you the name as well. Yeah, so it was Thomas Cately, who has this book called The Fairy Mythology. And he was a friend of the household, of the Rossetti household, and the book was a favorite of the children. In that book, he had gathered the fairy stories of different countries, the dwarfs and the, elves and the goblins, etc. So the plot of Goblin Market is obviously different, but this whole setting or decor of Goblin Market is, kind of influenced by those tales. And then you also have references to the fairies in William Shakespeare's plays, for example, A Midsummer Night's Dream, where we have Puck and we have Bottom and we have Titania and we have all those fairies moving around. So, these are basically the sources of Goblin Market. And I had also talked a lot on the cries of the goblin men. So what does this cry exactly refer to? On one hand, I think it refers to the labor of women writers in the marketplace. Now, what does that mean? We know that historically speaking, the literary canon has been overtly masculine, which is to say that we have a flurry of male writers starting from, Chaucer and then Shakespeare and Milton and Wordsworth and Coleridge. All the great stalwarts are male writers. But what about the female writers? Right. So this absence of female writers in the literary canon, it's not that women were not writing, but they were not getting published because they were women. So what happens to those writing? These women, they are constantly crying in the literary marketplace. They are pleading the reader to come and have a look at their writing as well, because they deserve to be writers as well, isn't it so? So yeah, the cry actually also refers to these female authors who have always been struggling to present their work before the audience, but they always had a lack of audience. And the fruit here obviously refers to the creative fruit. The second thing, it also refers to the economy of prostitution through the vending of bodies. So this, the exchange which is found in prostitution can be well plotted in the manner in which Laura kind of, presents the golden lock of hair to the goblin men for the fruits. And finally, there is this idea of the adulteration of foodstuff and the growth of advertising culture, which obviously comes with consumerism and capitalism, something that I had mentioned in the class. So with this rapid, period of industrialization, a lot of exotic food were finding their way to the English tables. Okay, so the global market forces, industrial revolution, everything affected the type of food which were raised and harvested, the speed with which it was shipped to the Londoners, urban dwellers. So the local vendors, they suffered a lot because nobody was willing to buy things from them. They were more interested in the exotic food which were being transported and shipped from elsewhere. So this cry of the goblin men also refers to the cries of the local vendors who were losing out on their jobs, who were trying their best to maintain the economy, who were trying their best to, earn the living which they had been getting for such a long time. So yeah, the cry also refers to the cries of the London local vendors who had been in a very difficult situation. And Christina Rossetti, being a dweller of the London city, she must have heard this, and it had a kind of reflection in her mind. And other than that, we have also spoken about the psychological aspects, where I said that Lizzie and Laura are two sides of the same human being, and I had also discussed the idea of id and superego, the primal desires which are repressed in your mind, and on the other hand we have the very strict invigilating factor which is trying to control all your desires in the form of society. So these two things which are always at conflict perhaps can be represented by the figure of Laura and Lizzie. And I will not go into details because that will perhaps only spoil the lecture, because it requires a lot of description and tiny details, and since I have done that in the class, it's better that you go through your class notes for this. So I think this should be enough for you. When you are studying for Goblin Market, go ahead with the title. Try to focus on the relationship between the two sisters. Talk about sisterhood, which becomes very important in the face of the very overrated brotherhood. For example, the pre-Raphaelite brotherhood and the many brotherhoods that had come before. Talk about how Goblin Market is trying to subvert the biblical narrative of Christ being the hero and savior. So it's not true that it's always a man who comes as a savior, comes as a hero, and the women solely has to, have to do the work of a nurse. No, that's not true, because the role playing is something which is interchangeable, and that is what we learn in our daily activities too. Men go to office, women stay inside the home. That should not be continued any longer. Well, they can do it if they wish to, but otherwise not, because the roles are interchangeable. Women will also go to office, men will also stay inside the house to prepare the meals. So it is the division of labor that we are aiming at. And that's what Lizzie does. She, on one hand, is acting as a very caring and protective mother. And on the other hand, she's also acting as Princess Charming, who is, protecting the damsel in distress from the goblin men by bringing the antidote to her. So yeah, that. And you can also just have a glance at the symbols and the images, which are very common and you will get perhaps in any site on Goblin Markets. So yeah, I think this should suffice. Go through the JSTOR materials which I have highlighted, and if you have any problem, then you can obviously get back to me. You can give me a call or email me. And some of you also had your projects done on this topic. So if you have done your project, then I believe that the ideas, they have become more clear and more lucid before you. And last but not the least, do find out some time to read the poem at one go, because every line has deeper meanings and deeper connotations which you need to figure out, and that will only happen when you read the poem. If you don't read the text, then you are really missing out on a lot of things. So yeah, I guess I'll just end the lecture, and once again, thank you for listening.